In Cuba, Fidel Castro's new revolutionary government nationalizes U.S. companies and draws closer diplomatically to the USSR. Eisenhower commissions the CIA to organize his downfall. In Africa, the Congo gains independence, and after elections, Patrice Lumumba is appointed prime minister. But in the rich uranium mining region of Katanga, independence movements break out, supported by the Belgian army. On the other side, the USSR and Third World countries defend Lumumba. The CIA then intervenes to organize his downfall. Colonel Mobutu seizes power and organizes Lumumba's arrest and execution. In the United States, Kennedy becomes the new president. He advocates for peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union while continuing to contain the spread of communism around the world. In Cuba, counter-revolutionaries, armed by the CIA, land on the island, but the offensive is repulsed. At the same time, the USSR sends the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. Now, Kennedy decides to invest heavily to make up for lost time in the space race and to become the first country to set foot on the moon. In the same year, although no agreement has been reached on West Berlin, the Soviets begin building a wall to divide the city and halt migration from east to west. The Soviet Union, which has caught up to the West in industrial and military terms, is now testing an atomic bomb 3,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. At the same time, the Soviet Union takes advantage of the failure of the Cuban invasion to move closer to Cuba and obtains authorization to deploy nuclear missiles there, which pose a direct threat to United States soil. Realizing this, Kennedy deploys his military fleet and imposes a total quarantine on the island, blocking the arrival of Soviet ships. Tensions reach a climax, and the two powers are on the brink of nuclear war. But an agreement is finally reached. Khrushchev undertakes to withdraw his nuclear missiles, in exchange for which Kennedy promises not to invade the island and also to withdraw U.S. nuclear missiles which are situated in Turkey and Italy. After coming close to nuclear war, the two superpowers begin a series of meetings to calm the situation. An agreement is reached to limit nuclear testing, and a direct telephone line is set up between the Kremlin and the White House to avoid future incidents. In Vietnam, tensions remain high between the North and the South, which is defended by the United States. In August of 1964, after a series of controversial incidents, the United States steps up its military involvement, massively bombing the North and deploying troops. The U.S. also lands troops in the Dominican Republic, where it fears a revolution similar to that which took place in Cuba. Finally, in Indonesia, the United States supports General Suharto, who, after overthrowing the communist government, begins a bloody crackdown on his opponents. More than 500,000 communists are massacred, and hundreds of thousands more are imprisoned in camps. At the same time, the war in Vietnam intensifies, forcing the United States to deploy up to 500,000 troops. But in early 1968, North Vietnam and the Communists in the South organize a major counteroffensive. In the United States, victory seems to be slipping away, and the war becomes increasingly unpopular. At the same time, in Czechoslovakia, the government begins a democratic transition. The USSR then invades the country, along with 3 other Warsaw Pact members, to re-establish a pro-Soviet government. Brezhnev, now head of the USSR, hardens his foreign policy. Conversely, Nixon, the new president of the United States, wants to reduce the country's military presence around the world, including in Vietnam, while providing financial and material support to countries fighting communism. At the same time, the United States makes up much of its lost ground in the space race, and on July 21, 1969, Armstrong and Aldrin become the first men to walk on the moon. In the Gulf of Aden, Somalia, after a coup d'etat, and South Yemen, which has been independent since 1967, are both turning to the Soviet camp. In 1971, the UN passes a resolution allowing the People's Republic of China to replace Taiwan as a permanent member of the Security Council. Nixon then makes his first trip to China to establish initial contact. 3 months later, he goes to Moscow to sign an agreement to limit the arms race. Finally, in 1973, the United States formalizes its total disengagement from Vietnam after failing to find a lasting peace solution. That same year, at the fourth meeting of the Non-Aligned Movement in Algiers, 75 countries are represented, including in Latin America, where the United States is determined to prevent any communist governments at all costs. But in Chile, since 1970, the country is governed by Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist who is implementing a program close to communism. The CIA is tasked with secretly organizing his downfall. On September 11, 1973, following a military coup, Augusto Pinochet seizes power and establishes a violent military dictatorship. The following month, Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel. The USSR supports the offensive, while the USA sets up an air corridor to supply Israel. In the end, a ceasefire is signed, but tensions have risen between the two superpowers. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces invade the south of the country. In the United States, Congress blocks any military intervention, and within a few months, the Communists win and reunify the country, while Laos and Cambodia also fall to Communist powers. In Africa, following Portugal's withdrawal from its colonies, war rages in Angola. The communist camp, supported by the USSR and Cuba, wins, and the new country becomes part of the Soviet camp. Finally, in Europe, the USSR installs new, more powerful nuclear missiles, which threaten Western Europe in particular, thus rekindling tensions. In Afghanistan, the Communist Party seizes power. On the other side, Mujahideen rebels, supported by Pakistan and China, organize a revolt that turns into a civil war. At the same time, the United States begins full diplomatic relations with China, establishing an embassy in Beijing. The country also authorizes the CIA to help support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But as the situation becomes more complicated, the USSR decides to intervene militarily and invades the country. Tensions between the two superpowers rise again. U.S. President Carter relaunches the country's armaments program and announces economic sanctions against the USSR, while NATO responds to the new Soviet missiles by installing its own nuclear missiles in 5 Western European countries. Regarding the Olympic Games in Moscow, most Western and Arab countries boycott the event. In Poland, strikes undermine the government and lead to the creation of Solidarity, the first independent free trade union in the Eastern Bloc. In the United States, Ronald Reagan is elected president and further tightens the country's foreign policy. He pledges to train and arm all political opponents of communist governments without sending in armies. The death of Brezhnev in 1982 is followed by a period of instability in the USSR as the Union's economy stagnates and the Soviet army becomes bogged down in Afghanistan. In 1985, Gorbachev comes to power and pursues a policy of international appeasement. He renews contact with the United States, with whom he agrees to reduce military arsenals by 50%. But the following year, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster is another blow to the Soviet Union, which struggles to manage the crisis and whose image is tarnished worldwide. On the domestic front, Gorbachev attempts economic reforms and openness to increase freedom and transparency. At a third meeting with Reagan, the two agreed to withdraw their nuclear missiles from Europe, putting an end to the Euro missile crisis. In 1988, the USSR undertakes to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan and then announces the withdrawal of a large number of its soldiers stationed in Eastern Europe. While this policy is successful on the international stage, within the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, this policy of relaxation facilitates the organization of opposition movements. In Poland, the first elections are held with the Solidarity Party victorious. In Hungary, the country opens its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to migrate to West Germany unchecked. Finally, Gorbachev announces that he will not intervene to protect the Berlin Wall. The wall is torn down on November 9, 1989. The following month, Gorbachev and new U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush meet in Malta and declare an end to the Cold War. Following the collapse of communist rule in Eastern Europe and German reunification, instability rages within the USSR itself. The Baltic republics are the first to proclaim their independence. On July 1, 1991, the Warsaw Pact is dissolved. The following month, Gorbachev narrowly avoids a coup d'etat. Weakened, he loses control of the Soviet Union as more and more republics declare their independence. Finally, on December 25, 1991, the USSR becomes an empty box and Gorbachev is forced to resign. Over some 45 years of tension, the USA and the USSR never faced each other militarily. The name Cold War derives from this period, during which the two superpowers competed diplomatically, industrially, and technologically, without any direct military confrontation.